With due respect, Secretary, the first thing you said was, quote, what happened was our ICE officers were out in an enforcement action. They got stuck in the snow. Correct. Because of the adverse weather that is in Minneapolis. They were attempting to push out their vehicle, and a woman attacked them and those surrounding them and attempted to run them over and rammed them with her vehicle. Mm-hmm. That's not what happened. We all saw what happened.
It absolutely is what happened. Those officers had been out in enforcement action. A vehicle had been stuck. They had come to help get that vehicle out. That's when this individual started blocking traffic for minutes and minutes.
You said that the woman attacked them and surrounded them and attempted to run them over and ram them with her vehicle.
Blocked the road for a long time and was yelling at them and impeding a federal law enforcement investigation. That's what you need to focus on, Jake, is they were breaking the law by impeding and obstructing a law enforcement operation. They were breaking the law already, and these officers were doing their due diligence of what their training had prepared them to do to make sure they were handling it appropriately.
You said within hours of her being killed, you said that she was a domestic terrorist. How do you define domestic terrorist?
She weaponized her vehicle to conduct an act of violence against a law enforcement officer and the public.
It's your duty to protect your constituents, to protect our democracy. How much do you need to see, hear, and feel before you do something?
The interview that unfolded with Secretary Kristi Noem on CNN with Jake Tapper was the kind of televised confrontation that exposes the deep fissures between public narrative and recorded reality. From the moment Noem began speaking, it became clear that confidence alone could not shield her from scrutiny. She entered the conversation assured, composed, and certain that reiterating official statements would be sufficient to maintain credibility. That certainty, however, quickly disintegrated. Every assertion she made was met with precise challenges grounded in verifiable evidence. Every attempt to frame events in the department's favor only highlighted contradictions in the official account. Tapper's approach was methodical, patient, and deliberate. He did not interrupt or shout, yet his measured questions allowed the inconsistencies in Noem's statements to emerge naturally. It was a textbook example of how careful questioning can reveal flaws in narratives carefully constructed to appear airtight. The focus of the interview centered on the killing of Renee Good and the Department of Homeland Security's immediate response. Within mere hours of the incident, DHS issued a statement that presented a definitive version of events, portraying ICE officers as victims and labeling Good as a domestic terrorist. The speed and certainty of the statement drew immediate criticism, with many noting that no comprehensive investigation had yet occurred. Key figures, including Republican Senator Thom Tillis, publicly remarked that such instantaneous assertions of fact from senior law enforcement officials were highly unusual, inappropriate, and inconsistent with best practices in investigative procedure. Noem, however, remained unflinching, asserting that she had witnessed the evidence, spoken to officers, and received all necessary information to justify the department's statements. Her insistence on certainty before the completion of any formal investigation would soon become a central point of contention and would expose deeper issues regarding accountability and transparency within the administration. The chronology of events, as Tapper presented it, sharply contradicted Noem's public assertions. The shooting occurred at 10:37 a.m. Eastern, and just over 2 hours later, DHS issued a statement outlining a complete narrative, including justification for the ICE officers' actions and allegations against Renee Good. This rapid conclusion occurred while the crime scene was still being processed, evidence was still being collected, and witnesses had yet to be fully interviewed. Tapper highlighted that law enforcement generally exercises caution in such circumstances precisely because premature declarations risk obstructing justice, misinforming the public, and undermining the integrity of subsequent investigations. Noem's repeated defense that she had already spoken with officers and supervisors, viewed videos, and understood the facts was systematically dismantled as Tapper presented the timeline and discrepancies between official statements and recorded footage. The video evidence, according to the journalist, directly contradicted the claim that Good had attacked ICE officers or attempted to run them over. The footage instead showed a different sequence of events. Good blocked traffic briefly, but the officers' actions, the sequence of shots fired, and the unfolding confrontation did not align with the narrative the DHS sought to establish. By insisting that her statements were factual while simultaneously being unable to reconcile them with video evidence, Noem revealed a dangerous tendency within law enforcement to prioritize narrative control over impartial investigation. This insistence on certainty before fact-finding had profound implications, signaling that public perception and political alignment were taking precedence over procedural integrity. As the interview progressed, Tapper introduced additional evidence that further strained Noem's credibility. A recording from the officer's own cell phone surfaced, featuring language that could be considered slurs directed at Renee Good. When confronted, Noem did not deny or condemn the language. Instead, she hesitated and deflected, prioritizing the protection of personnel over the acknowledgement of the facts captured on video. This pattern of evasive responses underscored a broader systemic issue. The administration's approach to law enforcement appeared focused on shielding officials and controlling the narrative rather than presenting an unbiased account of events. The footage of the shooting itself became another focal point. The first shot was fired through the windshield, but subsequent shots went through the side window after the officer had moved out of immediate harm's way. When asked for justification, Noem did not address the physics and timing of the shots, nor did she analyze whether they were proportional to the threat. Instead, she spoke about general officer training, the chaos of split-second decisions, activist interference, and political context, leaving the fundamental factual discrepancies unaddressed. Tapper's strategy highlighted how the administration conflated authority and accountability, treating labels such as domestic terrorist as preemptive shields to deflect scrutiny rather than carefully applying them after thorough investigation. In doing so, DHS not only mischaracterized the incident but positioned itself above the investigative process, potentially obstructing justice before it could even commence. The contrast between the administration's actions and the video evidence could not have been starker. Where DHS sought to portray a quick and decisive narrative, reality reflected complexity, nuance, and a need for careful deliberation. Tapper pressed repeatedly, emphasizing that the public had already seen the footage and that this evidence directly challenged Noem's claims. Her repeated insistence on certainty before the investigation revealed a political calculus. Ambiguity threatened authority, while evidence threatened narrative. The administration's framing functioned less as a commitment to truth and more as an effort to consolidate control over public perception. Throughout the interview, the larger implications of this approach became apparent. By prematurely labeling Renee Good and defending an officer involved in the shooting without substantiating facts, Noem demonstrated a willingness to sacrifice investigative integrity for expediency and narrative dominance. This incident, as revealed under the questioning, was emblematic of broader systemic issues in law enforcement where political alignment and perception management often override impartiality, transparency, and accountability. As the conversation progressed, the discussion shifted toward the broader implications of the administration's handling of law enforcement and public accountability. Tapper systematically highlighted that the rush to judgment in Minneapolis was not an isolated misstep but reflected a pattern in which narrative control was prioritized over careful fact-finding. By asserting absolute certainty immediately after the shooting, Noem and other officials effectively framed public perception in a way that insulated personnel from scrutiny. Tapper pressed her repeatedly on why the administration had chosen this course, emphasizing that the public deserved not only rapid statements but statements grounded in verified evidence. In response, Noem continued to assert that she had spoken with officers, reviewed video, and understood the situation. Yet, she was repeatedly confronted with evidence that contradicted her claims, including the timeline, eyewitness accounts, and the cell phone video from the officer involved. Each challenge highlighted a critical gap between the department's official story and what could be objectively verified, exposing the limitations of relying solely on authority to justify public narratives. The interview illuminated how political imperatives can compromise law enforcement neutrality, particularly when officials equate rapid messaging with transparency rather than recognizing that accountability requires thorough investigation and patience. A central theme in the interview was the tension between procedural integrity and political messaging. Tapper meticulously broke down the timeline, showing that DHS issued a definitive narrative just 2 hours after the incident occurred, while investigative work was ongoing and evidence was still being processed. This sequence revealed a fundamental problem. When the administration issues conclusions prematurely, it undermines the investigative process and erodes public trust. Noem's responses repeatedly relied on her presence at the scene and conversations with officers to justify certainty, but Tapper highlighted that personal observation and secondhand accounts could never substitute for comprehensive, evidence-based investigation. The video footage of Renee Good, the sequence of shots fired, and the apparent discrepancies between the officer's actions and the DHS narrative all underscored that there were critical aspects of the incident that had not been reconciled. By refusing to address these inconsistencies directly, Noem revealed the administration's reliance on labeling and narrative framing to control public perception. The interview made it clear that the issue was not merely about the facts of one incident, but about how power and authority are exercised to shape public understanding, often at the expense of transparency and accountability. Another pivotal moment in the interview came when Tapper introduced the recording from the officer's own phone, in which derogatory language was used toward Renee Good. Noem's reluctance to acknowledge or condemn the language highlighted the tension between defending personnel and upholding accountability. Her deflection demonstrated a willingness to shield individuals from criticism while maintaining the department's narrative, even when objective evidence suggested otherwise. This raised profound questions about institutional priorities. When protecting personnel and narratives takes precedence over factual accuracy, the line between enforcement and political instrument becomes blurred. Tapper's questioning emphasized that accountability requires confronting uncomfortable truths, even when they challenge established hierarchies or political alignment. By repeatedly pressing Noem to reconcile her statements with recorded evidence, the interview exposed the fragility of the department's public messaging and underscored the dangers of conflating authority with legitimacy. In effect, Noem's performance revealed a systemic issue in which narrative dominance is prioritized over factual integrity, creating an environment where public statements may obscure, rather than illuminate, reality. The interview further explored the broader political and societal context, including the different standards applied to law enforcement officers versus civilians, particularly in politically charged situations. Tapper raised the contrast between the immediate labeling of Renee Good as a domestic terrorist and the more lenient treatment of individuals involved in politically aligned actions, such as the January 6th attacks. Noem's repeated insistence that laws were enforced equally collapsed under scrutiny when confronted with video evidence and documented pardons. The distinction between political alignment and accountability became glaringly apparent. While some actions were condemned and prosecuted rigorously, others, aligned with the administration's political interests, received leniency and even formal protection. This inconsistency not only undermined public confidence but also highlighted a broader structural problem in which law enforcement becomes a tool to reinforce political narratives rather than serve as an impartial arbiter of justice. Tapper's careful dissection of these events emphasized that the issue was not simply procedural missteps but a fundamental misalignment between law enforcement operations, public transparency, and the ethical responsibilities of those in power. As the interview moved deeper into the details of the incident, the conversation highlighted the human and societal consequences of rushing to judgment. Tapper repeatedly stressed that the premature labeling of Renee Good as a domestic terrorist had tangible implications not only for her and her family but also for public trust in law enforcement institutions. By preemptively defining the narrative, the administration effectively framed the investigation before it even began, shaping how the public, media, and political actors perceived the event. Noem's insistence that she had already verified the facts through conversations and video footage failed to address the fundamental flaw. The public record was incomplete, and critical aspects of the incident remained unexamined. Tapper skillfully illustrated that accountability is not merely about communicating quickly or asserting authority, but about ensuring that statements reflect verified, comprehensive information. The contrast between Noem's confident assertions and the available evidence created a persistent tension throughout the interview, underscoring how public perception can be manipulated through narrative control while substantive truth remains secondary. One of the most revealing aspects of the exchange was the way Noem attempted to frame the discussion around training, split-second decisions, and procedural norms. While these elements are indeed relevant to law enforcement protocols, they could not substitute for addressing the documented discrepancies in the sequence of events. Tapper methodically demonstrated that video evidence contradicted key elements of her account, showing that the officer fired multiple shots after being out of immediate danger, which Noem did not directly explain. Her reliance on abstract justifications, training, rapid decision-making, and prior experience served to shift focus away from the physical reality captured on video. This technique of deflection illustrated a common tactic in politically sensitive cases: emphasize procedural correctness or institutional safeguards while avoiding the direct scrutiny of specific actions. Tapper's persistence forced the spotlight back onto evidence-based analysis, exposing the gap between official statements and observable facts and highlighting the risk when public officials prioritize narrative over accountability. The discussion also brought to light the broader implications of selective enforcement and political bias within law enforcement. Tapper drew comparisons between the immediate protection and support extended to ICE officers and the delayed or inconsistent responses to other politically charged incidents. The juxtaposition was stark. While some groups received rapid and unequivocal validation, others faced skepticism, delayed investigation, or even condemnation. Noem's repeated references to transparency and equal enforcement could not withstand scrutiny when juxtaposed against objective records and documented pardons of individuals with political alignment to the administration. Tapper emphasized that these discrepancies undermine the rule of law and create a perception that law enforcement is selectively applied, eroding public confidence. By systematically breaking down these inconsistencies, the interview revealed that the administration's approach was not just a communication problem, but a structural issue in which political priorities influence operational decisions, shaping outcomes in ways that are often invisible to the public until a critical examination occurs. Finally, the interview illuminated the personal and political stakes for officials like Noem, who must navigate the tension between defending personnel, maintaining public credibility, and upholding the principles of justice. Tapper highlighted moments where Noem's defensiveness and reliance on narrative authority clashed with the incontrovertible evidence available, revealing the vulnerabilities inherent in managing high-profile incidents. Her performance demonstrated the dangers of conflating position with expertise. Authority alone cannot justify conclusions that contradict observable facts. By letting Noem articulate her version while systematically exposing inconsistencies, Tapper effectively illustrated the difference between institutional power and accountable governance. The broader lesson of the interview extends beyond this single case. When officials prioritize narrative control over factual integrity, they risk eroding the public's trust in the institutions designed to protect and serve them. This tension between authority, accountability, and truth formed the central theme of the discussion, making the interview not just a critique of one individual's statements, but a broader commentary on systemic challenges in politically influenced law enforcement. The final moments of the interview underscored the broader societal consequences of rushing to judgment without comprehensive investigation, particularly when high-ranking officials are involved. Tapper highlighted that the public relies on accurate information not just to understand events, but to maintain trust in the institutions tasked with enforcing law and order. Noem's insistence on certainty, despite unresolved questions and conflicting evidence, revealed a deeper tension between authority and accountability. By asserting that she had verified facts immediately through selective observations and conversations, she attempted to position herself as both the arbiter of truth and the guarantor of justice. Yet in doing so, she bypassed the fundamental principle that evidence must speak before conclusions are drawn. This approach risks establishing a precedent where the narrative is imposed first and factual verification becomes secondary, eroding confidence in law enforcement agencies and government statements alike. The interview illustrated that when officials conflate rapid response with accuracy, the public loses a reliable framework for understanding events, and accountability becomes a matter of rhetoric rather than actionable oversight. Tapper also focused on the discrepancies between Noem's statements and the documented reality of the incident. The video evidence, which clearly contradicted her portrayal of Renee Good's actions and the officer's response, became the anchor for analysis, demonstrating that observable facts should always take precedence over narrative control. Noem's attempts to explain away these contradictions by emphasizing split-second decision-making, training, and prior knowledge reflected a broader strategy frequently used in politically charged situations, appealing to institutional norms to mask inconsistencies. Tapper systematically dismantled this defense, showing that while procedural context is relevant, it cannot justify statements that misrepresent what actually occurred. The segment revealed a critical insight into the dynamics of public accountability. Transparency is not merely a claim to have observed events, but a willingness to align official narratives with verifiable reality. By juxtaposing evidence against Noem's statements, the interview underscored that credibility is earned through consistency and truthfulness, not through authority or position. Another dimension of the discussion emphasized the political implications of labeling individuals and shaping the narrative prematurely. Tapper explored how the immediate classification of Renee Good as a domestic terrorist influenced public perception, potentially prejudicing investigations, media coverage, and political discourse. Noem's rigid adherence to this characterization, despite emerging evidence that contradicted her statements, highlighted the risks inherent in narrative-first governance. Tapper's analysis illuminated the consequences of politicizing law enforcement actions, showing that once labels are applied, they can serve to shield officials from scrutiny, while simultaneously shaping public opinion in ways that may distort justice. The interview served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of combining authority with unchecked narrative control. When political priorities override factual analysis, accountability becomes secondary, and public trust is undermined. The broader context of the interview also examined the challenges of selective enforcement and perceived bias within law enforcement agencies. Tapper drew comparisons to other politically sensitive cases, highlighting the differences in how events are framed based on the political affiliations of the individuals involved. The disparities between rapid support for aligned personnel and scrutiny of others emphasize that law enforcement, when influenced by politics, can inadvertently or deliberately create dual standards of justice. Noem's repeated claims of fairness and transparency faltered under this scrutiny, revealing a systemic problem. Public officials who prioritize alignment with political narratives over objective analysis risk eroding the foundational principle that all individuals are subject to equal enforcement under the law. The discussion demonstrated that when enforcement becomes selective, it not only undermines specific cases, but also weakens the legitimacy of institutions responsible for upholding law and order. Finally, the interview concluded with a reflection on the personal and institutional implications of such incidents. Tapper highlighted that Noem's defensive posture and reliance on narrative authority exposed the vulnerabilities of officials when public evidence contradicts their statements. The conversation underscored the critical importance of evidence-based governance. Authority and position cannot substitute for truth, and public trust depends on transparency, consistency, and accountability. By allowing the evidence to speak for itself, Tapper effectively shifted the focus from rhetoric to reality, providing viewers with a clear framework to evaluate both the incident and the broader systemic challenges. The interview served as a demonstration of how media scrutiny can enforce accountability, not through confrontation alone, but through careful analysis, evidence presentation, and consistent questioning. It emphasized that in politically charged environments, truth must remain the foundation upon which public discourse is built, and that officials who prioritize narrative over facts risk not only public credibility, but also the integrity of the institutions they serve. This analysis, while focused on a single interview, reflects broader trends in governance, law enforcement, and public accountability. It shows that when officials act with certainty in the absence of complete evidence, the consequences extend far beyond the immediate incident, influencing public trust, political discourse, and the perception of institutional legitimacy. By examining the discrepancies between statements and verified evidence, this interview provides a critical lesson for policymakers, law enforcement leaders, and the public. Transparency requires patience, careful observation, and a commitment to aligning narrative with reality. The interview demonstrated that accountability is not achieved through assertion alone, but through evidence, consistency, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. For audiences seeking a nuanced understanding of power, authority, and accountability in contemporary governance, this discussion serves as a compelling illustration of why careful analysis, evidence-based scrutiny, and persistent questioning remain essential pillars of democracy.